Two apiaries, same region, same forage, same season. One consistently produces surplus honey, the other does not. The beekeeper at the underperforming yard has newer equipment, cleaner hives, and more hours invested. The beekeeper at the productive yard has less of everything, except one thing. And that one thing is not a product, not a treatment, and not a tool. It is a precise understanding of what is happening inside the colony at the biological level and when to act on it. Have you experienced this in your own hives, working harder than a neighbor, only to see their honey house fill first? If this kind of biology-based analysis is useful to you, a like on this video helps more people find it. The question of why some apiaries outperform others has been asked as long as organized beekeeping has existed. In the late 19th century, when Langstroth's movable frame system was spreading across North America and Europe, beekeepers in the same townships with identical equipment were producing wildly different results. The early apicultural journals, including the American Bee Journal and Gleanings in Bee Culture, published letters from frustrated beekeepers who could not explain the gap. The answers that came back from experienced voices were almost always the same. It is not the box, it is the timing of what happens inside the box. What most beekeepers misunderstand is this colony output is not primarily a function of hive design or even population size alone. It is a function of the ratio of foraging bees to non-foraging bees at the precise moment the primary nectar flow arrives. A colony can be enormous and still generate minimal surplus if that population is weighted toward the wrong demographic at the wrong time. To understand why, it is necessary to understand the basic age structure of a honeybee colony and how that structure shifts across the season. A worker bee does not forage from the moment she emerges. For roughly the first 3 weeks of her adult life, she performs internal hive duties, cleaning cells, feeding larvae, building comb, receiving nectar from incoming foragers, and regulating temperature. She is, in the language of colony biology, a house bee, a nurse bee, a processor. She is essential, but she is not contributing to surplus honey production. She is, in a net sense, a consumer of the colony's resources during this phase. It is only after approximately 21 days of adult life that a house bee graduates to forager status. Her hypopharyngeal glands, the structures used in larval feeding, begin to regress. Her flight muscles strengthen, her orientation flights begin. And then for the remaining 2 to 4 weeks of her life, she becomes the engine of the colony's honey production. This transition is not random. It is not accelerated by feeding supplements or larger equipment. It follows a biological clock set at emergence. And this is the mechanism that determines why some apiaries outperform others. Strong colony. Wrong ratio. A colony that enters the primary nectar flow with a high proportion of nurse bees, perhaps because it swarmed 3 weeks prior, or because a new queen was introduced late, or because brood production surged too far into the population, will have enormous numbers of bees that are biologically incapable of generating surplus honey. Those bees are not failing, they are doing exactly what their biology requires. But the timing is misaligned. The productive apiary does not have better bees. It has bees whose demographic curve has been managed or has naturally aligned, so that the largest cohort of foragers is active precisely when the forage is available. If you value biology-based beekeeping, consider subscribing. Historical beekeepers understood this not in the language of modern biology, but in the language of observation. They called it getting the bees up for the flow. They could not name hypopharyngeal gland regression or describe the neurochemical shifts that accompany the nurse-to-forager transition. But they knew from watching, from keeping careful notes, from comparing hives side by side, that a colony which had just raised a large brood would not produce heavily until those young bees had aged through their house duties. The apiarists who consistently outperformed their neighbors in the 1880s and 1890s were not necessarily managing more hives or investing in newer imports. They were timing their interventions, splits, removals of frames, manipulation of brood nest positioning, to ensure that the forager population peaked in alignment with the bloom calendar of their specific region. Dadant, writing in the early 20th century, was explicit about this. The management decisions made 4 to 6 weeks before a flow were more determinative of surplus production than anything done during the flow itself. The beekeeper who was reactive, who only responded to what the colony was doing in real time, was always behind the biological curve. This is the first layer of the performance gap. It is about preparation lag. Here is where the common mistake enters. Many beekeepers monitor their colonies primarily for visible strength, the presence of brood, adequate bees covering frames, queen activity, and the absence of obvious disease. These are not wrong things to monitor, but they describe the colony's current state, not its projected demographic state at the time of peak forage. A colony inspected in late spring that shows wall-to-wall brood across 8 frames looks healthy. It looks productive. It looks like it is positioned to perform. But if that brood is largely eggs and young larvae, and the primary flow in that region arrives in 5 to 7 weeks, then the timing mathematics reveals something less encouraging. Brood takes 21 days to emerge. The emerged bee then requires another 21 days before she becomes a forager. That means the bees being raised from eggs today will not be contributing to honey production for approximately 6 weeks. If the flow peaks in 5 weeks, those bees arrive after the window. They will forage, but into a declining flow, and in support of autumn stores rather than surplus. More brood, less timing. The beekeeper who understands this is not alarmed by a heavy brood nest at the wrong moment. They are managing it. They are looking at the demographic curve that brood nest will produce and asking whether it aligns with the forage calendar. If it does not, intervention is warranted, not to weaken the colony, but to shift the population curve. The method used by experienced historical beekeepers to manage this demographic alignment was straightforward in principle, though precise in execution. The primary tool was the manipulation of sealed brood frames, specifically the strategic removal or redistribution of frames containing capped pupae in the 10 to 14 days before emergence. By pulling frames of sealed brood from a colony that was demographically heavy in house bees and placing them into support colonies or nucleus boxes, a beekeeper could accomplish 2 things simultaneously. First, the donor colony's nurse bee population was reduced, shifting the internal ratio toward older bees closer to the forager transition. Second, the colony was relieved of the physiological demand of tending those larvae, freeing older house bees to redirect energy toward comb construction and nectar processing. This technique required a specific window. It was most effective when applied 2 to 3 weeks before the anticipated flow peak. Any earlier, and the colony's demographic recovery would overshoot, potentially pushing the forager cohort into the pre-flow period when there was insufficient nectar to drive collection. Any later, and the bees emerging at peak flow would be too young to forage, arriving in the house bee demographic precisely when foragers were most needed. The measurement that mattered was frames of sealed brood, not total population count. Experienced beekeepers in this tradition were not counting bees. They were reading the brood nest as a population projection. A frame of capped pupae in a standard Langstroth deep represents approximately 1,500 to 2,000 bees that will emerge within the week. 5 frames of sealed brood means 7,000 to 10,000 bees arriving in the house bee category within 7 days. The beekeeper's job was to decide whether the colony needed that population, could support it, or whether that population would arrive at the wrong biological moment. There is a second mechanism embedded in the outperformance gap that receives even less attention than demographic timing. It concerns the physiological state of the forager herself. A forager bee does not operate at constant efficiency throughout her foraging life. Her performance is shaped by the internal condition of the colony she returns to. When a forager returns to a hive and nectar acceptance is slow, because house bees are occupied with brood tending, or because the combs are congested, or because the colony is managing a large population of newly emerged bees, that forager experiences a measurable delay in the cycle between delivery and redeparture. Research in the 20th century confirmed what experienced 19th century beekeepers observed empirically. Forager return rate and departure frequency are sensitive to colony congestion and reception capacity. A colony that is biologically congested, too much brood being tended, insufficient available comb for nectar deposition, high nurse bee demand on house bee attention, produces slower foragers, not lazy foragers, not unhealthy foragers, slower foragers. The cycle time from return to redeparture lengthens by minutes. Over the course of a 6-week flow, that friction compounds into measurable differences in stored honey. The apiarists who consistently outperformed understood that spaciousness inside the hive was not about comfort, it was about cycle efficiency. Supers added ahead of congestion, not in response to it, maintained the internal conditions that kept forager cycle time short. One historical rule of thumb in American commercial beekeeping from the early 20th century: add a super when 1/3 to 1/2 of available comb space in the upper box is drawn and filled, not when the bees are hanging out the entrance. By the time bees are bearding heavily at the entrance from internal congestion, days of forager cycle friction have already accumulated. Congestion costs time. Time costs surplus. Now consider the third layer, which connects the first two, and explains much of the persistent performance gap between apiaries that share the same forage territory. Swarm management is typically taught as a practice aimed at preventing the loss of bees. That framing is accurate but incomplete. The biological cost of an unchecked swarm impulse is not primarily the loss of the swarm itself, though that is real. The larger cost is the demographic disruption that precedes and follows it. A colony building toward swarm creates a specific brood pattern. Queen cell construction typically begins in earnest during a period of high nurse bee density, when the ratio of house bees to available brood has become unfavorable, and the biological pressure toward reproduction increases. This is the colony responding correctly to its own internal conditions. But from the beekeeper's perspective, it means that in the weeks before a swarm issues, the colony has been rearing queen cells, potentially reducing laying by the existing queen, and preparing for population division, all during a window that may overlap with or immediately precede the primary flow. A colony that swarms 7 to 10 days before flow peak does not simply lose half its foragers. It enters a biological recovery period. The remaining colony must raise a new queen, wait for her mating flights, and wait for her to begin laying. The emerging worker cohort from that new laying will be house bees for 3 weeks after emergence. The colony has effectively reset a portion of its demographic clock at the worst possible moment. The apiaries that consistently produce do not simply prevent swarms. They manage the conditions that trigger the swarm impulse before that impulse reaches the point of queen cell construction. This means monitoring the nurse-bee-to-brood ratio, providing adequate space for expansion, and when necessary, making controlled splits that relieve population pressure without disrupting the primary colony's forager capacity. A controlled split made 6 to 8 weeks before the flow, using a small nucleus with the old queen and 3 frames of bees and brood, achieves multiple objectives simultaneously. It relieves swarm pressure. It allows the primary colony to raise a new queen, which refreshes the brood cycle and can produce a favorable demographic surge, and it creates a nucleus colony that, managed correctly, can be reintegrated or maintained as a production unit the following season. This is the method. This is what the consistently productive beekeepers were doing in the 1890s, and what the best practitioners continue to do today. Not with new equipment, not with imports, with timing, brood frame reading, and an understanding of the population curve. The seasonal window for these interventions is narrow and region-specific. In temperate North American climates with a primary spring flow driven by fruit bloom, tulip poplar, or black locust, the critical decision window typically falls in the 4 to 6 weeks preceding first major bloom. This places it in early to mid-spring, a period when many beekeepers are still in assessment mode rather than management mode. The colonies look fine, the weather is still variable, the flow feels distant. And that is precisely the period when the decisions that determine autumn honey house weight are being made or missed. In climates with a late summer or fall primary flow, goldenrod, aster, late wildflower mixes, the same logic applies but shifted. The critical management window moves to midsummer. The beekeeper who waits for visible signs of flow preparation at that point is already behind. Monitoring the regional bloom calendar and working backwards 6 weeks from anticipated flow peak is the calibration exercise that historically distinguished productive apiaries from reactive ones. It is not complicated. It does not require expensive equipment. It requires a calendar, a brood frame inspection protocol, and the discipline to act on demographic projection rather than current appearance. The performance gap between apiaries is, in most cases, a timing gap. It is a gap between beekeepers who read their colonies as static organisms to be assessed and beekeepers who read their colonies as dynamic population systems to be projected. The bees are the same, the forage is the same, the equipment is often comparable. What differs is the model the beekeeper carries in their mind when they open a hive. The historical beekeepers who left records of consistent outperformance were not working harder. In many accounts, they were working less during the flow itself because the colony was already aligned. The management had been done. The surplus was accumulating without intervention because the biological conditions for surplus had been established in advance. That is the lesson the old apicultural journals were trying to transmit. And it remains, across all changes in equipment and technique, the most reliable path to consistent production. If this breakdown was useful, leave a comment with your experience. Subscribe for more historically grounded beekeeping insights.